He didn't mean to hold her hand, but once he did, letting go became the most dangerous choice of his life. The city bus wasn't supposed to matter. It was just noise, just movement, just a place where strangers disappear into their own thoughts. Lee Seo-jun liked places like that, places that asked nothing from him. Then the bus lurched around a corner. A small hand reached out in the wobble and grabbed his. He looked down. Kim, 6 years old, braids neat, eyes wide with the kind of trust that doesn't negotiate. Her fingers tightened like she'd decided without asking that he was safe. Seo-jun didn't pull away, not because he was kind, but because his body moved before his mind could correct it. He'd spent years perfecting the art of being untouchable, and yet here he was undone by a 6-year-old with a tighter grip than any enemy he'd ever faced. Across the aisle, her mother, Darlene Miller, noticed, not with panic, with that quiet, exhausted vigilance only a mother carries. She didn't know who he really was. She only knew her child had chosen him in a moment that felt too natural. And that was the problem. Because for a man like Seo-jun, SJ to the shadows, every connection becomes a liability and every kindness comes with a cost. If you love cinematic stories where one small moment can change everything, tap like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments the city or country you're watching from. Now, let's see what happens when the bus stops. And he has to decide whether he can let go. The interior of the bus smelled of wet umbrellas and old upholstery, a scent that usually served as a signal for Lee Seo-jun to drift into a state of total observant numbness. He sat near the middle, his back straight, his eyes fixed on the rain-streaked window. To anyone passing by, he looked like a weary office worker or perhaps a quiet scholar. He wore a tan jacket that blended into the beige walls of the city, masking the ink on his neck and the cold precision in his movements. In the world of the syndicate, he was SJ, a man who operated in the silence between heartbeats. But here, on the number 14 line, he was just another passenger. He preferred the anonymity of the bus. It was a moving purgatory where nobody looked too closely at their neighbor. He was counting down the stops, mentally mapping his route to the safe house, when the driver took the corner at 4th Street too fast. The bus lurched, tires screeching against the slick pavement as the vehicle tilted sharply to the left. Beside him, a small figure swayed dangerously. Before he could calculate the risk or assess the tactical disadvantage, his hand shot out. It wasn't a conscious choice. It was the honed reflex of a man who had spent a lifetime anticipating sudden, violent movements. His palm met a much smaller one. Kim didn't just brush against him. She gripped his hand, her small fingers locking around his with a strength born of pure instinctive survival. Seo-jun froze. The warmth of her skin felt like a brand against his palm. He looked down and saw her, neat braids, a pink shirt that had seen better days, and eyes that held a terrifying lack of fear. She wasn't crying. She was simply holding on, her small frame steadying itself against his solid weight. For the first time in years, Seo-jun felt something he couldn't recognize. It wasn't the adrenaline of a fight or the cold satisfaction of a successful deal. It was a low, humming vibration in his chest, a recognition of a vulnerability that had nothing to do with him, yet was now entirely his responsibility. The moral tension of the moment settled over him like a heavy shroud. He didn't pull away, but he didn't squeeze back either. He simply became the anchor she needed. Across the aisle, Darlene Miller leaned forward, her hand reaching out but stopping short when she saw the connection. She looked at Seo-jun's face, sharp, guarded, and undeniably masculine, and then at her daughter's hand in his. She was a woman who lived in the margins, working double shifts to keep a roof over their heads, and her instincts usually shouted at her to be wary of strangers. But today, the exhaustion was too deep. She saw the way Kim looked at the man, and for a fleeting moment, she saw the stability her daughter had been missing. As the bus leveled out and continued its slow crawl through the city, the moment stretched. No words were spoken, no choices were made yet, but the air in the bus had changed. Seo-jun remained a statue, but the ice around his heart had developed a hairline fracture. He was a man who lived by distance and control, yet here he was, tethered to the world by a grip no larger than a few inches. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of a contact that neither of them had planned, but that both of them now carried. The doors of the number 14 bus hissed open at the corner of 12th Avenue, and Lee Seo-jun stepped out into the biting wind. The warmth of Kim's hand was gone, replaced by the damp, sharp air of the city, but the sensation of that small grip lingered like a phantom limb. He shoved his hands deep into his jacket pockets, his fingers curling into his own palms as if trying to squeeze out the memory of the contact. He walked with a steady, predatory rhythm, weaving through the late afternoon crowd with a fluidity that made him invisible. To the world, he was a ghost. To himself, he was a man who had just made a dangerous mistake. His destination was a nondescript apartment complex in the industrial district, a place where the hallways smelled of stale grease, and the walls were thin enough to hear the quiet despairs of his neighbors. This was his sanctuary, a cold, sterile box filled with nothing but the essentials. There were no photographs on the mantel, no books on the shelves, and certainly no traces of a life lived for anything other than survival. He locked the 3 deadbolts behind him and stood in the center of the room, the silence of the apartment pressing in on him. He moved to the small kitchen, his movements mechanical. He poured a glass of water, staring at his reflection in the darkened window. This was the face of S.J., a man whose identity was a series of aliases and whose past was a graveyard of broken alliances. He had spent his entire adult life building a fortress of distance. In his world, emotion was a contaminant. It clouded judgment, slowed reflexes, and created vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit with surgical precision. He told himself that the moment on the bus meant nothing, that it was merely a biological reflex, a glitch in his programming. He sat at a small wooden table and began to disassemble his sidearm, the familiar click and slide of metal providing a grounding comfort. He cleaned each part with obsessive care, his mind trying to return to the cold logic of the syndicate's current operations. There was a shipment coming into the docks on Thursday. There was a mole in the Western Territory that needed to be flushed out. These were the things that mattered. These were the variables he could control. And yet, as he looked at his hand, the same hand that had held a 6-year-old steady, he felt an alien sense of displacement. He was a man who didn't belong in the world of pink shirts, neat braids, and wide, trusting eyes. He belonged in the shadows, in the back rooms of high-stakes gambling dens, and in the silent, lethal encounters that happened in alleyways just like the one below his window. The image of Kim stayed behind his eyelids. He remembered the weight of her trust, the way she hadn't looked at his scars or sensed the darkness he carried. To her, he was just a safe place to hold on when the world tilted. To him, she was a reminder of every human thing he had sacrificed to become S.J. He tightened his grip on the barrel of his gun until his knuckles turned white. "It was just a bus ride," he muttered to the empty room. His voice sounded hollow, a stranger's rasp in a silent tomb. He forced himself to go through his nightly routine, checking the perimeter cameras, reviewing the encrypted messages from his lieutenants, and preparing for a future that offered no room for mistakes. He tried to convince himself that the wall he had built was still intact, but he knew the truth. A man like him survived on the belief that he was untouchable. But today, a child had touched him, and for the first time in a decade, the man who didn't belong anywhere felt the crushing weight of his own solitude. The fluorescent lights of the laundromat hummed overhead, a sterile contrast to the rhythmic slosh of water behind thick glass. Darlene Miller sat on a plastic chair that had seen better decades, her eyes fixed on Kim, who was coloring a picture of a house with a yellow roof. Darlene's mind, however, was miles away, anchored to the interior of the number 14 bus. She was a woman who lived in a state of perpetual vigilance. In a neighborhood where the sirens never seemed to stop and the rent increased faster than her wages, caution wasn't a choice. It was a survival mechanism. She had spent years teaching Kim the rules. Don't talk to strangers, stay close to Mama, and never, ever let go of her hand in a crowd. Yet, earlier that day, she had watched her daughter break every rule in the span of a single sharp turn. Darlene replayed the moment in her head for the 100th time. She saw the man in the tan jacket again. He had been so still, scary still, until the moment the bus lurched. She remembered the way his hand had caught Kim's. It hadn't been a grab, it had been a shelf, a solid place for her child to land. What troubled Darlene wasn't the action itself, but the reaction. Kim hadn't recoiled. She hadn't looked to her mother for permission. She had simply held on. She looked at the man's face in her memory. He had the eyes of someone who lived in the dark, cold, calculating, and weary. He looked like the kind of man her father had warned her about, the kind who brought trouble just by standing downwind. And yet, there was something else. A flicker of something that looked remarkably like shock. When Kim had gripped his hand, the man hadn't looked predatory, he had looked haunted. "Kimmy," Darlene said softly, her voice competing with the rattle of a dryer. "That man on the bus today. Why did you hold his hand for so long?" Kim didn't look up from her yellow roof. "He felt like a mountain, Mama. Mountains don't move when the wind blows." The simplicity of the answer made Darlene's heart ache. Kim was growing up in a world of shifting sand, temporary apartments, rotating shifts, and a father who was a faded memory in a wrinkled photograph. She was looking for something solid, and she had found it in a stranger whose neck was covered in shadows. Darlene weighed her instincts. Every protective fiber of her being told her to change their route, to take the earlier bus, or to walk the extra 10 blocks. But she also remembered the man's eyes. He hadn't tried to speak to them. He hadn't followed them. In fact, he had looked like he wanted to be anywhere else on Earth. He had stayed as an anchor, not out of desire, but out of a sudden, strange necessity. She made a choice then, not a loud one, but a quiet, calculated risk. She decided to trust the moment for what it was, a brief intersection of two lives that had no reason to meet again. She told herself it was harmless. She told herself that a man like that wouldn't care about a tired mother and a little girl. As she gathered their warm laundry, the scent of cheap detergent filling the air, Darlene felt a small sense of relief. She would keep her eyes open, as she always did, but she wouldn't let fear steal the only piece of stability her daughter had reached for that day. She didn't know that the mountain her daughter had described was currently sitting in a dark apartment, reassembling a weapon. She didn't know that by letting the moment pass, she was allowing a thread to remain tied, a thread that was about to pull them both into a world where mountains were built on graves. The rain had stopped, leaving the city in a state of perpetual, shimmering dampness. 2 days had passed since the lurch of the bus, and Lee Seo-jun had spent every hour of them convincing himself that he would never take the number 14 line again. He had mapped out 3 alternative routes to his contacts near the shipyard. He had even considered taking a car, despite the risk of being tracked by traffic cameras. But as 4 p.m. approached, he found himself standing at the familiar rusted sign on the corner of 5th and Main. He told himself it was a matter of efficiency. The other routes were too slow. But as he stepped onto the bus, his heart rate did something it hadn't done in years. It spiked. He moved toward the back this time, choosing a seat that offered a clear view of the entire cabin. He sat with his collar turned up, a man trying to be a shadow in a room full of light. He watched the stops pass, his eyes scanning every new passenger with a cold, professional detachment. Then, at 8th Street, the doors opened, and a flash of pink entered the frame. Darlene climbed the steps first, looking more exhausted than before, her shoulders slumped under the weight of a heavy grocery bag. Behind her, Kim practically hopped onto the bus. Seo-jun felt a strange, tightening sensation in his throat. He looked away, staring intently at an advertisement for a local law firm on the wall. He didn't want to be seen. He wanted to be a mountain that had successfully hidden itself in the mist. But Kim was 6, and her world was not governed by the rules of the syndicate. She scanned the seats with a purposeful intensity until her eyes landed on the man in the tan jacket. A small, bright smile broke across her face, not a smile of surprise, but of recognition. She didn't run to him, and she didn't call out. Instead, she tugged on her mother's sleeve and pointed toward the back. Darlene hesitated. She saw Seo-jun sitting there, his posture as rigid as a tombstone, and she felt that prickle of caution again. But she also saw the genuine spark of joy in her daughter's eyes. She made a silent, weary calculation and led Kim toward the seat directly across from him. "Hello again," Darlene said, her voice cautious but polite as she settled the groceries at her feet. Seo-jun gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't speak. He couldn't. His mind was screaming that this was a breach of protocol. He was S.J., a man who lived by distance, yet he had allowed himself to become a landmark for a child. The ride was quiet. Kim didn't reach for his hand this time. She seemed content just to be in his orbit. She sat swinging her legs, hummed a quiet tune, and occasionally glanced up at him to see if he was still there. The connection felt familiar now, like a rhythm they had both stepped into without realizing. It was restrained, respectful, and utterly terrifying to a man who relied on being forgotten. Seo-jun found himself watching the way Darlene's hand rested protectively on Kim's shoulder. He saw the frayed edges of her coat and the way she checked her watch every few minutes. He realized he was learning things about them, their schedule, their habits, their vulnerabilities. And he knew that if he was learning these things, someone else could be too. The audience of the city moved around them, oblivious to the fact that a high-ranking mafia boss was sharing space with a struggling family. To the passengers, they were just a tired mother, a happy child, and a quiet man. But as the bus pulled toward their stop, Seo-jun felt the weight of the pattern he was establishing. This wasn't a one-time accident anymore. It was a quiet return. He was no longer just a passenger on the number 14. He was becoming a part of their story, and in his world, stories rarely had happy endings. 2 weeks had passed, and the number 14 bus had become a strange, silent sanctuary. The city outside was a jagged landscape of tension and hidden wars, but inside the rattling metal frame of the afternoon transit, a fragile peace had taken root. For Lee Seo-jun, the routine was no longer a tactical error. It was a reprieve. He sat in the same seat every day, a man of iron and shadows who had found an unlikely anchor in the presence of a child and her mother. Everything felt safe. The silver cars that usually trailed him were nowhere to be seen, or perhaps he had simply stopped looking for them with the same feverish intensity. He found himself relaxing in a way that felt almost reckless. Kim no longer just sat across from him. She would sometimes lean over to show him a drawing she had made in school, vibrant, chaotic splashes of color that stood in stark contrast to the monochrome reality of his life. She had decided he was her friend, and because children do not understand the complexities of hidden identity, she treated him with a simple, devastating kindness. Darlene, too, had begun to lower her guard. The exhausted vigilance that usually defined her posture had softened. She had started offering small, quiet smiles when they boarded, not the forced politeness of a stranger, but the genuine acknowledgement of a shared journey. One afternoon, when the bus was particularly crowded, she even sat beside him, their shoulders nearly touching as she sighed in relief from a long shift at the hospital. "You're always so consistent," she remarked softly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the road. "In a city that feels like it's falling apart, you're just here." Seo-jun didn't know how to tell her that his consistency was a byproduct of a life built on rigid discipline and the avoidance of variables. Instead, he just looked at the way Kim was humming to herself, kicking her feet against the seat. "The world is louder than it needs to be," he replied. It was the most he had spoken to her in days, and the sound of his own voice felt like a confession. For those few miles between the downtown core and the residential outskirts, the syndicate didn't exist. SJ didn't exist. There were no orders to give, no betrayals to anticipate, and no blood to wash away. He allowed himself to believe the lie that this gentle rhythm could continue indefinitely. He convinced himself that the situation was harmless, that he could keep these two worlds separate by the sheer force of his will. He was a man who had spent years perfecting the art of being untouchable, yet he was currently finding his greatest comfort in the one thing that made him most vulnerable. The audience of his life, the lieutenants and rivals who watched from the periphery, were momentarily forgotten. He watched Kim laugh as a dog barked at the bus from a sidewalk, and for a fleeting second, he felt a genuine sense of relief. He felt like a man who had finally found a place to rest. He didn't see the flicker of a camera lens from a car parked 3 blocks ahead. He didn't notice the way the bus driver checked his rearview mirror a little too often. In the warmth of the afternoon sun streaming through the windows, the danger felt like a distant memory, a story told about someone else. He didn't know that the peace he was feeling wasn't a victory. It was merely the silence before the first crack appears. The golden light of the previous week had turned into a sharp, clinical gray. It started with a look held too long. As the bus pulled away from the curb at 5th and Main, Seo-jun noticed a man standing by a newsstand. The man wasn't reading. His eyes were locked on the windows of the number 14 with a predatory focus that Seo-jun hadn't seen in years. It was a gaze he recognized. It was the look of a hunter who had finally located the scent. Inside the bus, the atmosphere shifted. The gentle rhythm they had established felt suddenly fragile, like glass under pressure. Seo-jun felt a cold prickle at the base of his neck. He adjusted his position, shifting his weight so that his body shielded Kim and Darlene from the line of sight of the street. He realized with a jolt of adrenaline that he was no longer just a passenger. He was a target, and he had brought the bullseye right into their laps. Kim, oblivious to the change, tugged on his sleeve. "Look, Mr. Mountain, I drew you a dragon today." She held up a crumpled piece of paper, but for the first time, Seo-jun didn't look. His eyes were darting between the side mirrors and the other passengers. A man in a dark hoodie had boarded 3 stops back and hadn't looked up from his phone once, yet his posture was too tense, his boots too sturdy for a casual commuter. "That's nice, Kim," Darlene whispered, her voice trailing off as she caught Seo-jun's expression. The smile she usually held for him vanished. She saw the hardness return to his jaw, the way his hand hovered near the hem of his jacket, and the terrifying, cold light in his eyes. The cracks were no longer just in his armor. They were appearing in the reality she had allowed herself to believe in. "Is something wrong?" Darlene asked, her voice trembling slightly. Seo-jun didn't answer immediately. He saw a black sedan pull out from a side street and begin to trail the bus, maintaining a perfect 2-car distance. It was the syndicate. They weren't hiding anymore. They had seen the chairman of the board holding hands with a child, and they had realized that the ghost could be bled. "Don't look back," Seo-jun said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. "When we get to the next stop, I want you to stay on the bus. Don't get off where you usually do. Go all the way to the end of the line." "Why? Who are you?" Darlene's grip on Kim's hand tightened until the girl winced. "It doesn't matter who I am," Seo-jun replied, his eyes finally meeting hers. The mask was gone. The quiet office worker had vanished, replaced by S.J., the man who commanded the shadows. "What matters is that you trust me for 1 more mile. Keep her head down." The calm of the past 14 days had been a lie, a beautiful, temporary hallucination. As the bus slowed for the next intersection, Seo-jun realized he had been seen more than he should be, and the cost of that visibility was starting to come due. The air in the bus felt thin, charged with the static of an impending explosion. The cracks had widened into a chasm, and as the doors hissed open, Seo-jun knew that the safety of the number 14 was officially dead. The bus continued its journey, but for Seo-jun, the cabin had transformed into a cage of glass and steel. Every rattle of the engine felt like a countdown. He could feel the weight of his private life pressing in, threatening to crush the small space of peace he had tried to carve out. For years, he had lived as a man without a shadow, a ghost who moved through the city leaving no trace. But by sitting on this bus, by allowing a child to draw him dragons, he had stepped out of the darkness and into a spotlight he could no longer turn off. Through the rear window, he watched the black sedan. It didn't weave through traffic. It held its position with a disciplined, military patience. These weren't just street thugs looking for a quick score. These were his own people. They were the men he had trained, the men who knew his every tactic. They had finally understood that S.J. wasn't invincible. He was a man with a pulse, and that pulse was currently tied to the heartbeat of the girl sitting across from him. Darlene was staring at him, her face pale. She didn't need to see a badge or a gun to know that the man in front of her was something far more complex than a mountain. She saw the way his eyes never stopped moving, the way he scanned the street with a lethal geometry. The realization hit her with the force of a physical weight. She hadn't found a sanctuary. She had found the epicenter of a storm. "You're not who you said you were," she whispered, her voice trembling as she pulled Kim closer. "I never said who I was," Seo-jun replied, his voice devoid of emotion. He was retreating back into the cold logic of S.J. He had to. Any trace of the man who enjoyed drawings or shared quiet smiles would get them killed. And right now, the only thing that matters is that those people outside believe you belong to me. The audience watching the screen of his life saw the truth surfacing in the tension of his jaw. He was a man caught between 2 identities. To the syndicate, he was a leader who had gone soft. To Darlene, he was a monster who had hidden in plain sight. He felt the crushing irony of his situation. He had spent a lifetime avoiding connections to stay safe, yet the only thing that made him feel alive was now the very thing that ensured his destruction. As they passed the shipyard, the crane's shadows stretched over the bus like giant, skeletal fingers. Seo-jun checked his watch. He had 3 miles before the end of the line, 3 miles to decide how to sever the thread without drawing blood. He looked at Kim, who was now clutching her drawing to her chest, her wide eyes darting between her mother and the mountain, who had suddenly become cold and distant. The weight of the truth was settling over all of them, a heavy, suffocating blanket that reminded them that in the city of shadows, no kindness goes unpunished. The bus slowed as it approached the edge of the industrial district, the streetlights flickering to life against the deepening gloom. Inside the cabin, the air was cold, but the tension was white-hot. Lee Seo-jun faced the hardest decision of his career, and it had nothing to do with territories or profit margins. He had reached the terminal point. He could either withdraw now, severing the bond entirely and letting Darlene and Kim disappear into the subway system, or he could stay and allow the connection to draw the fire directly toward him. He looked at Kim. She wasn't smiling anymore. She could sense the shift in the atmosphere, the way the mountain had suddenly become jagged and sharp. She reached out, her small hand hesitating in the air as if she wanted to grab his one last time to see if the anchor was still there. Seo-jun felt a sharp, agonizing pull in his chest. He wanted to reach back. He wanted to tell her that everything would be fine, but he knew that every inch of closeness he allowed now was a death sentence. He chose restraint. He pulled his hand away, tucking it into his pocket, his face a mask of cold indifference. The cost of that movement felt heavier than any bullet wound he had ever sustained. "When the doors open," he said to Darlene, his voice devoid of the warmth they had shared, "you get off. You run to the transit police kiosk. Do not look at me. Do not wait for me. If you see me again, you walk the other way." Darlene looked at him, her eyes filling with a mixture of betrayal and desperate understanding. She saw the man he had to become to save them. The cold, calculating SJ, she realized that the choice he was making was a sacrifice, but to Kim, it just looked like a goodbye. "Why are you being mean, Mr. Mountain?" Kim whispered, her voice cracking. Seo-jun didn't look at her. He couldn't. He stared at the reflection of the black sedan in the window, watching it pull to the curb just behind the bus. The choice was made. He was stepping back into the shadows, pushing them away with a cruelty that was his only remaining gift to them. He was choosing the safety of distance over the warmth of the touch, even if it meant becoming the villain in a little girl's story. The bus came to a final, jarring halt. The doors hissed open, inviting the cold wind inside. Seo-jun stood up, his presence filling the aisle like a dark cloud. He didn't say another word. He just waited for them to leave, his body a silent barrier between the family and the world he had built, a world that was currently waiting with the engine running and the lights dimmed. The pavement was wet, reflecting the red and blue neon of the terminal like spilled ink. Darlene and Kim vanished into the crowd of the station, their footsteps swallowed by the roar of the city. For a few seconds, Seo-jun stood alone on the curb, the empty bus behind him looking like a hollowed-out ribcage. Then, the silence broke. The black sedan didn't accelerate. It drifted to a stop inches from his knees. The window rolled down with a slow, mechanical whine. Inside sat a man Seo-jun had known for 20 years, his second-in-command, a man whose loyalty had been bought with blood and iron. "SJ," the man said, his voice flat. "The elders are asking questions. They saw the footage from the 4th Street intersection. They saw the mountain letting a child hold his hand. They want to know if the ghost has finally found a reason to stop haunting and start living." The truth was out. There was no longer any use for the tan jacket or the weary commuter's slouch. Seo-jun straightened his back, his entire aura shifting from a mundane stranger to a lethal architect of the underworld. The hidden identity that had protected his peace for those few weeks on the bus was stripped away, leaving only the cold, hard reality of who he was. "She's nothing," Seo-jun said, his voice a razor blade. "A tactical diversion, nothing more." "Is she?" The man in the car leaned out, his eyes scanning the station entrance where Darlene and Kim had disappeared. "Because the elders think she's a weakness, and in our world, a weakness is just a target that hasn't been hit yet." The revelation hit Seo-jun with a sickening clarity. By trying to be a man, he had put a death warrant on the only 2 people who had seen him as anything other than a weapon. He realized that the syndicate didn't care about the truth. They cared about the perception of power. If he was seen to be soft, the entire empire would crumble. He looked at the station, then back at the man in the car. The danger was no longer a shadow in the distance. It was sitting right in front of him, breathing. He had spent his life ending conversations with a look, but now the conversation was about to end with a life. The revelation wasn't just about his name or his rank. It was the realization that he could never truly leave the bus. He was trapped in a cycle of movement and noise, and the only way to save the girl was to make sure she never, ever saw him again. The rain had returned to the city, turning the streets into a blurred watercolor of gray and neon. A month had passed since the night at the terminal, a month that felt like a lifetime for Lee Seo-jun. He had spent those weeks in a brutal, silent purge, dismantling the faction of the syndicate that had dared to follow him. He had reestablished his dominance with such cold, calculated violence that his name was once again spoken only in whispers. The ghost had returned, more formidable and unreachable than ever before. But today, he wasn't in a black sedan or a high-rise office. He was standing at the familiar rusted sign on the corner of 5th and Main. The number 14 bus pulled up to the curb, its brakes groaning in the damp air. Seo-jun stepped on, dropped his fare, and moved toward the back. He sat in the same seat, his back straight, his eyes fixed on the window. The interior smelled of the same wet umbrellas and old upholstery. It was an echo of the beginning, a perfect parallel of the day the world had tilted. At 8th Street, the doors hissed open. Darlene Miller stepped on first. She looked stronger now, the exhaustion replaced by a hardened, watchful peace. Behind her, Kim hopped onto the bus, her braids swaying. She was wearing a new jacket, sturdy and blue. As they moved down the aisle, the air seemed to thicken. Kim's eyes scanned the rows with that same purposeful intensity, searching for the mountain that had once been her anchor. She saw him. Her footsteps faltered. For a heartbeat, the joy of recognition flared in her eyes, and she started to move toward him. But Darlene's hand tightened on her shoulder, a silent warning. Darlene looked at Seo-jun, and in that look there was no longer any confusion. She knew exactly who he was. She saw the man who had traded his humanity to keep them alive. She saw the protector who had to be a monster so they could be safe. The bus took a sharp turn, the tires splashing through a deep puddle. The vehicle lurched violently to the left. Kim stumbled. Her small hand reached out instinctively, searching for the solid, steady palm that had caught her once before. Seo-jun saw her wobble. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to reach out, to close the gap, to be the anchor one last time. His hand even twitched on his knee, the phantom warmth of her grip burning against his skin. But he didn't move. He stayed as still as a statue, his hands folded in his lap, his gaze fixed forward. He did not take her hand. He let her find her own balance against the back of a seat. To hold her now would be to tie her to his darkness forever. To let her go was the only way to let her live. Kim looked at him, her hand hanging empty in the air. The smile faded from her face, replaced by a quiet, mature understanding that no 6-year-old should have to possess. She realized the mountain was no longer hers to climb. She turned back to her mother and sat down, her back to him. Seo-jun watched their reflection in the window as the bus moved on. He had given them the ultimate gift, the safety of his absence. He was a man who lived by distance and control, and this was his final act of mastery. He had come full circle, ending exactly where he started, a man alone on a bus, surrounded by strangers. As the bus reached his stop, he stood up and walked toward the front. He didn't look back. He stepped off into the rain, the doors hissing shut behind him with a sound like a final breath. The echo was complete. The silence had returned, but it was no longer empty. It was full of the weight of a choice that had saved a life and broken a heart. The bus pulled away, carrying the only light he had ever known into a future he could never share. This concludes our journey into the life of the man they call S.J. It's a story that reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous choice isn't to fight, but to let go. If this ending stayed with you, please like and subscribe to help us bring more cinematic stories to life. What do you think? Did Seo-jun make the right choice by remaining silent at the end? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to mention the city or country you're watching from. Until next time, stay safe in the shadows.